So, simulation. The root concept, the root idea of simulation, as far as I can tell, so the root concept is like reality. So can we have simulation? Well, it's a question. So if the root concept is like reality, then can we have games that are like reality? So can we have simulation games? Can we have simulation in games? It doesn't make sense to me to talk about the reverse, having games in simulation, but simulation in games makes some sense. So the base concept of just simulation as like reality helps me anyways. So building on from there to something much more specific is that we can look at simulation as an imitation of the operation of a real-world process or system over time. So a process or system over time sounds to me like the operation of a system, or the functioning of a system. And there we have that imitation concept. So simulation as some type of imitation of a real-world process or system over time. The imitation, of course, goes right back to that root concept of like reality. Like reality. By the way, right away we can probably set aside well, simulations can be altered realities, because I guess you can still have a simulation that is like reality, but it is not either an accurate imitation or it is or an altered imitation of reality. But anyways, probably set that aside for sake of discussion right now. And underlying simulation somewhere is the idea of modeling. And a model is, well, first of all, models also function. And what is functioning in a model? I mean, a model is made up of two or more pieces working together, functioning together for something. So at least this is one concept of model. Well, I guess in a more simple sense, a model represents different characteristics of what? Of different characteristics of a physical or abstract system or process. So a model airplane that is highly detailed and an accurate representation of a Spitfire airplane. The model sits on the table. It doesn't actually do anything, but it is an accurate and detailed representation of a real-world Spitfire airplane. That clearly is a model. But you also have a model airplane that not only is that, but it also has a little functioning motor, a spinning propeller. It actually, creates whatever the physical process is for, lift and it actually flies. Related to the first, but also clearly distinct, this model actually functions in imitation like the real thing. Okay, so modeling is down there at a kind of a lower conceptual level. And on top of modeling, I think, at least conceptually, we have simulation. And simulation, again, is in some way an imitation, or yeah, it's some type of replication of a real world, again, function or system over time, again, usually based on, or we can talk about being based on modeling. So can we have military simulations? From everything that we've said, I don't in any way see why we can't. Pretty much to have any interesting military simulations, you're talking about very complex processes, multiple complex systems interacting over time, but at least in principle, it should be possible. Now, of course, games are, first of all, the concept of game is very different than simulation. These apparently have come together in the past, but they're not really, well, they're hardly related at all, right? A game is an activity of some sort, competitive in nature usually, that is based on skill and or luck. But then can you put them together? Can you have simulation in a game? Again, I don't see why not. But this is just, when I say I don't see why not, that's really just, this is all just an opening here. Conceptually, I don't see why, by definition, all of this is not possible. By definition, can you simulate military operations? Yes. I don't see why not. Can you have simulation in a game? Again, I don't see why not. I mean, if nothing else, the definition of game is so broad that seems to me you can have simulation in there. And again, simulation in gaming, I think of playing Monopoly as a kid. You have simulated economic activities, processes. You're accumulating money, you're investing money, you're developing property, you're buying, you're selling. All simulated. Imitation, looking like the real world. And still a game. Still competitive, based on a combination of skill and luck. Simulation and game. Okay. Now, where does this all come from? Recently, I think about a week ago, I was actually following quite intently a discussion over on TMP, the miniature page. The miniature page sounds funny. So maybe it's miniatures page. I don't know, TMP. Under the game design section, I was following very intently a discussion. And unfortunately, it's not fresh in my mind, so I am recalling some of that discussion, but I'm also shaping what I'm saying here to support my own thinking here. So the purpose here is not for me to recount that discussion in detail. But the discussion went something like this. First of all, the discussion seemed to be centered on claims of historical accuracy in games, in rule sets, really, miniatures rule sets. Claims by designers and developers, publishers, I guess designers and publishers, about the historical accuracy of their rule sets. What does that mean? And actually, more specifically, it was, I think, should these claims be made at all? And if these claims are, and even more importantly, I guess actually should these claims be made wasn't that central of a part of the discussion, but it was central to the discussion of if designers and publishers are going to make these claims of historical accuracy, how and should they back these claims up? So the interest, my interest in the discussion, in following the discussion very closely, was the question of historical accuracy in game design, which in part goes to simulation in games. So I guess, as usual, this wasn't extensively planned or anything, but let's talk about, because this is what came to mind at one point as I was following the discussion. And there were these different claims of well, these words weren't necessarily used by the members of the two sides, the two general sides. Well, I guess I should kind of try to portray the two sides of the discussion. The discussion moved progressively to a point where there were generally two sides. So two sides basically crystallized. One side said basically, well, making claims for historical accuracy is fine, but that players, this is very distinct. This side of the argument said players are owed something to back up those claims of historical accuracy. This side of the discussion was looking for games to basically reveal what research went into the design, and how was that, what research went in, and how was that research basically assessed, or how it was assessed. What the designer, not only what the designers used as research, but how they interpreted whatever records or evidence or data went into it. As I recall, this side of the argument said we can have accuracy, we can have historical accuracy in a rule set. But again, I think the most important part for this side of the discussion is we can have all different degrees of historical accuracy. You can have just a bare minimum of historical accuracy, which actually might not be worth much whatsoever, and then you can have very high historical accuracy, levels of historical accuracy. But probably even, well, also important and related to that is people and gamers can basically judge for themselves claims of historical accuracy, and levels of historical accuracy. And I think that this side of the discussion would basically say that's a good thing. Then you had the other side of the discussion, which was basically, well, first of all, I'll say my personal opinion, the first side that I just explained. You know, this, by the way, let me say up front, this has nothing to do with me zeroing in on a right side and a wrong side. Absolutely not. I found the discussion all very interesting, but I feel very agnostic on kind of the so what of the debate. And there was some so what of the debate, which maybe I'll get to here. But in any case, I'm agnostic on the sides. I'm just going to comment that the first side that I just described there, they had their argument. Their argumentation was a lot tighter, which is not by in and of itself any indication of, you know, correctness or whatever. Their argumentation was well laid out and it was very tight. So I guess in that sense, I guess you either you know, go along with it or not. But the other side was definitely less tight. Their argumentation was yeah, quite squishy. Which now I'm not going to disguise my personal preference. Tighter argumentation is going to get more sympathetic attention on my part. Again, doesn't mean right or wrong, but you're just leaving frustration. You're just leaving me to go down a road of frustration if the argumentation is loose and yeah, squishy. So this side said, so this side was not saying that historical research and accuracy doesn't go into gaming or game design. This side said, yeah, sure, historical research assessment goes into game design. But this side was saying, first of all, the designers and the publishers revealing that is essentially waste of time. Again, this was where it wasn't very clear. There, well, some of it was clear. Wasn't what was clear is they said that side, this side of the argument said there's no evidence that players want this. So why should it be provided? And more importantly, I think to try to, you know, faithfully and honestly make this argument, you know, make the argument on this side. I think they were saying not only is there no evidence that players even want kind of the historical research and analysis that went into a rules design. They only care about, you know, the quote-unquote fun factor, which is interesting. It was interesting. The same thing came to my mind that the other side of the argument said, which is if players really don't, well, actually, yeah, if players really don't care about the claims of historical accuracy, why do designers and publishers continue to advertise their products in such a way? Now, for my part, I actually don't believe these are. Actually, I don't believe these things are contradictory. I.e., I think it's possible that designers consider it important to make claims of historical accuracy. I can see publishers having some interest in making claims for historical accuracy, if nothing else, as kind of as a marketing thing, as a product differentiation thing. And at the same time, I can see players not caring whatsoever about those historical claims of historical accuracy. Or another point is, it's perfectly possible that there's a kind of psychological dynamic going on whereby basically this is a psychological dynamic which basically says, let's say, oh, I am so bad with pulling up examples off the top of my head, which is why I avoid doing it, but I'm going to foolishly try here. Maybe this is like somebody, well, actually I'm looking at a copy of Military History Quarterly, so I will use the example of a magazine. Let's say there's a magazine, let's say I pay money and read avidly a magazine that claims to be about, I don't know, about wow. Okay, magazine that claims, yeah, that's all right. I'm going to finish my example, but already I feel it's not a good example. But a magazine that claims to be a literary review magazine. Okay, it claims to be. It has all the trappings of that. You know, basically a New York Times review of books, something like that. Magazine. I'm paying for it. It's a product. Somebody's trying to make a profit. I know that. I buy it. I know that. I mean, nobody has to tell me that it's a market being sold. It's a product being sold, marketed to me. And yet, oh, and somebody might even explain to me, your literary magazine is not really a literary magazine. It's really just, I mean, the people who pay money to create that magazine and get it to you are the major publishers who have their works reviewed in that magazine. It's nothing but it's that. It's a marketing piece. It's a publicity product, and yet it's sold to you as a, objective literary review magazine. Somebody can even explain that to me. Actually, not to me. Somebody could be explained to this. They can know it. This is the psychological dynamic. They can know it in a rational, logical sense. They can be shown it. And yet there's this psychological, of course I don't know the term, I don't know much about psychology, but there's a type of self-delusion. Well, reading this magazine, paying money and reading this magazine, and believing that it's a literary criticism magazine, literary review magazine, serves some purpose on an individual psychological level. It's not a rational thing. So, okay, horrible example, but back to war game rule sets. Maybe. I think it's perfectly possible. I'm not saying that I believe that this is the case. I really don't know, but I reserve the possibility that gamers, they recognize the claims of historical accuracy. But they may also know that there basically isn't much behind those claims. On the other hand, they don't really care that there may be nothing behind the claims. And essentially, well, basically, they're playing the rules, miniatures rules, for reasons unrelated to any historical accuracy. Okay, didn't really resolve much there, but I still wanted to explain some things that were going through my mind as I followed this discussion. Now, the side that said basically there is no overriding need to substantiate claims of historical accuracy in these miniatures rule sets, Here's where I think that side of the argument had real problems. And they basically said, if the rule set's really popular, if it sells well, if lots of players are playing it and enjoying it, that is justification enough for the rule set. And again, that argument I didn't consider very convincing at all. But that was present in the discussion. So that made me think about, again, can there be accuracy in these games? And so I was thinking back to, yeah, the reason why I want to talk about marksmanship. Is because there was some discussion about designers coming up with basically fire effectiveness. Okay, so there was in the discussion they were talking about designers coming up with fire effect. And of course, we're talking about periods long before. Well, anyways, we're talking about 18th century musket fire. We're talking about 18th century fire. Volley fire. All these different things you would imagine for miniatures rule sets. Okay, so one side of the argument seemed to, again, get dangerously close to the idea that it doesn't matter what the basis for the marksmanship, doesn't matter what the basis of the marksmanship formulas and rules and data are, as long as it's fun. In other words, it was like, I'll make something up right off the top of my head. Okay, we'll say this is a miniatures rule set. 1 inch on the game table represents 100 paces. 1 inch, 100 paces. Yeah, that's not good. Talking about musket fire here. We have musket units on the table, musket armed units on the table, whatever size. Maybe it's not even defined. I'm sorry. 1 inch equals, let's say, 10 paces. Yeah, right off the top of my head. And so we say a designer, and in no way am I suggesting that anybody does this, ever has done this, or whatever. But I want to show something. So a designer says, basically a designer says, when one unit is here, and a unit is here, and the designer says, when they are in normal range, I want to give the player a 70% chance of hitting the target with effectiveness at normal range, because I think that's what players are going to find fun. So at normal range, we're going to say a 7 or less is a hit. And then we're going to say for every inch that the target's closer, you subtract 1 from your die roll, right? So if it's 5 inches away, so 10 inches is normal range, and at that range you need a 7 or less to hit. So if the unit is 5 inches away, you're rolling 3 minus 5. Oh, look, you hit. The idea is you have range. You have conditions. I didn't mention that here, but you would have conditions, and you have chance. But these, well, I'll take out conditions here. Range and chance. They're present, but it's completely made up. I mean, it is made up. You can say that range and chance are present. They're there, but they're completely made up. This would be like, so this was my example that I thought of about, okay, when I came in the Army, joined the infantry, went right down to Fort Benning. Within weeks, I'm on my first firing range. I'm on a firing range, targets at different ranges. So I was basically a city kid. Grew up in the city, essentially never touched a weapon in my entire life before heading off to Fort Benning and, being handed a weapon, get on the range, hit some targets, Yeah. It wasn't exactly just do the best you can, but it was it was kind of close to that. All right, so what happened was early on in my infantry training, I started out essentially, just barely failing. So I started out, I think the minimum was something like 23 hits out of 40. I mean, I started out at about hovering around 20. So I was just barely failing marksmanship training. Now, I didn't feel that bad about it. Never did it before in my life, ever. So anyways, I went on, and a few years later, after firing on many ranges, getting lots of training, coaching, I basically wind up an expert shot. Okay, I wind up hovering around 39 out of 40. Okay, so clearly, the top classification, and that's because of learning, practice, and training. But let's say halfway between that process of getting better, the point is that to use percentile dice, I can make a simulation out of my going to the range and trying to qualify. So I can take all the real world, parameters, real world distances, target exposures, seconds, factor in time. This is a simulation, so factor in time, factor in ammunition, how much ammunition you get, how many magazine changes you will have to do to complete, and from now again, you could completely make it up. You could say, hey, what's really ludicrous is, hey, I'll just make a nice bell curve, because bell curves are nice, right? So I have a really high percent. I have an 85% chance, there we go, of hitting the 150 meter target. But I have to roll a 15 or less. Well, I actually got it. A 15 or less to hit the 50 meter target, and the same to hit a 300 meter target. I'll just make a nice bell curve. I mean, again, actually, it's not. It's a game. I guess if you make it competitive, I guess you could make a game out of that. It probably looks like a simulation, but I'm not sure it actually qualifies as a simulation, or it's a simulation of an alternate reality, but it's not a simulation of real world reality. So again, if at some point in my evolution of marksmanship capability, I could figure out, again, we can arrive at accurate, and you can always talk about degrees of accuracy. Actually, we should talk about degrees of accuracy, right? But the point is, again, I'm taking a particular point in my marksmanship. There was a 35% or 38, whatever. This is make it easier. 35% chance of hitting the 300-meter target, and a 90% chance of hitting the 50-meter target. I mean, these are a simulation to the extent that I can go out to the range, go through the whole test, get a real score, and then I can come back the next day. I go out to the range, sit down on the ground, roll a bunch of dice, go through the same, it's not the same, but go through a simulation, right? An analogous process of the qualification test, and I could, by getting the percentages right, I could get it so that by looking at the scorecards, you couldn't possibly know which was real and which was basically simulated. So the reason why I went through all this, in my mind, the reason I went through all this here is because I want to put my hands on something real here, because at some point in that discussion on TMP, somebody, man, they are not the only one. I've run into this way too often. People making a sweeping claim that there essentially is no such thing as simulation. That simulation is just it's a mirage, it's self-delusion or something. Now, some people make the argument that it's just too hard, and so it shouldn't, we don't need to try or whatever. But some people just claim it's basically false. There is no such thing as simulation. It's a false concept, which just, it's like, I don't know. I don't accept that from my own experience. For me, based on my experience, you can clearly simulate. Simulation is real to the point where, again, real simulation, in principle, you shouldn't know the difference. Not with certainty, anyways. So simulation matters. Now, again, I'm not sure what I think about the question about designers. Well, actually, I do have a personal preference, and that is that designers reveal something of their research and analysis. It's always research and analysis. I think that's a preference. I know many gamers just don't care about that. It's not either of interest to them, and they're not going to do anything with it anyways. It's wasted space for them, certainly. I understand that. But for me, yes. So then to get from there to game design, more broadly. So, again, to go back to so now to think more about game design more specifically, to go back to my specific, again, this is just a nice specific, and from my personal experience, concrete, enclosed, like the marksmanship test in the U.S. Army Infantry is a system. Well, it's certainly a process, but I guess it's also a system, and that can be simulated. I'm not talking about making into a game, but it can be simulated. And so when we when we talk about our percentages of target hits, then we can get into simulating visibility, simulating environmental conditions. Let's talk about those two. Visibility, again, is something that, again, would you have to figure out the effect. Yes, this is related to design for effect, but it's not to say that design for effect is somehow more important than anything else. It's just simulation involves those, remember, those pieces, those, well, yeah, the pieces of the phenomenon you're trying to simulate, and in there are effects, and effects affecting other things that become effects. So you have to, okay, let's just talk about visibility. To simulate visibility in our simulation of the marksmanship test, you need to have something, you have to get your hands on something real, whether it's data, or go out and gather your own data directly through first-hand experience, one or the other. But you're going to get some data, you're going to interpret it, because you have to figure out the effects of differences in visibility on your system, and then you're going to translate that into a way that your simulated visibility can interact with your simulated, again, marksmanship accuracy, back to ranges, seconds of target exposure, etc., etc., etc. Again, you're going to interrelate all these pieces. They have to talk to each other. That we're definitely into the design part now. But in that process, you can and you should be able to talk about where you got your initial real-world inputs, real-world inputs of some sort. And then others can make their own opinions, judgments about it, the worth of that input, and environmental conditions. So here's a good example. Again, good examples come from experience. So if you're out doing this marksmanship test in minus 20 degree weather, Fahrenheit, again, how are you going to simulate that? From experience, you are the extreme cold, and you can explain this as a designer. Your firer, your simulated firer, is wearing cold weather gear, which makes it correspondingly more difficult to handle and operate the weapon, which correspondingly produces some die roll modifier for every target engagement. And again, the numbers, whether it's a -2 or a -7 or -8, those are abstract. But if you correlate it back to, again, some real-world inputs, if you have real-world inputs of marksmanship differences according to environmental conditions, you can bounce your abstract pieces of simulation off of real-world inputs, and again make a judgment about that. Incidentally, at this point, I want to point out that, which is an interesting idea, you can do exactly the same thing I've said with simulation and everything, but you don't have real-world inputs. You basically have a made-up world. You have inputs from a made-up world. So two examples of this. One, you can talk about, combat on an asteroid in the 27th century, in which case you have marksmanship, or you have something that looks like marksmanship. You have something that looks like simulation, but again, basically your inputs are not real world inputs. They are an alternate world, and essentially, without implying any, this is not a pejorative statement, but it's made up. The inputs are made up. It doesn't change. It doesn't invalidate, conceptually, it doesn't invalidate the simulation. It is still a simulation, but it's only, I still reserve simulation for the real world. So this is like, it's what I would call that, at best I would call that an incomplete simulation. It's not complete because it's not tied back to the real world, the real world. But it's still a simulation. And you can still talk about accuracy. I mean, it's not real world accuracy. But you can talk about the accuracy just internally of the simulation itself. You can't, by the way, this is where you can talk about complexity and levels of complexity. But the other not real world input, and this is where I'm afraid, and I didn't even plan to get to this point. I'm off on stream of consciousness now. This is where I'm afraid some designers have gotten, where they have, whether deliberately or not, they've said, you know what, I'm not going to worry about real world inputs. I'm just going to go to what I think a lot of game players out there want. Game players out there, maybe, a lot of game players out there. Again, this isn't me talking. This is a fictitious game designer. A fictitious game designer might say, you know what, a lot of the game playing public, the game players are going to pay for my rule set. They probably watch a lot more movies and they read a lot more fiction than they do historical studies of 18th century marksmanship. And so the inputs in my simulation are going to be made up to produce, a simulation of not the real world reality, but a big screen reality. Big screen reality. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say that, as much as it pains me to say it, of Hollywood reality, and the simulate those. That's going to be the inputs. And if that produces a game design, a rule set that sells, that flies off the shelf, people like it, it's fun, it has everything players want, I can't, no argument here. There's no doubt that that's a successful product. There's no doubt that that's probably a successful, no, it probably is a successful game, meaning it's played at many different conventions. Got it. People talk about it. People talk about strategies and tactics, and get to its own websites and everything. But should all of that be confused with simulation? Back to what I said, I'm reserving really simulation essentially for the real world. And I think right here, wow, I came around full circle, didn't even plan this. This is what the other side of the argument, to go way back to the beginning, this is what the other side of the argument was saying. And even, I'm being generous here, I think the other side of the argument was saying, that's fine. You have a popular rule set, and it's fun, but then don't make claims of historical accuracy for that. That rule set that I just pointed out, I think that's what the other side of the argument was saying. And that's where I have to say, you know, again, I'm agnostic because, you know, because it's a great discussion, okay? But that's where I can't disagree with that side of the argument. Yeah, that's basically it. Claims of historical accuracy for a rule set that essentially, and again, now I'm going to, you know, I am wrapping this up. I'm going to put it sharply here. A rule set that was never even designed to be a serious historical study of any real world reality. It's funny that we have to, but I guess today we really do have to separate out, talk about made up realities versus real reality. I guess that's just something we have to accept. A rule set, popular, fun, sells, you know, great seller, never even intended to be a serious study, a serious serious simulation based on serious models, based on real world inputs. Never even intended for that, and yet for some reason it's sold with claims of historical accuracy. And I'll just comment on kind of where that discussion, it's not where the discussion necessarily ended up. I'm not actually sure where it exactly ended up, but one side of the argument says even if a tiny handful of game designers, game players are concerned about the claims of historical accuracy, even if it's just a handful and the rest are happily playing the rule sets, I guess that side of the argument is saying it's still an issue. It's an issue whether it's identified as an issue or not. It's a problem, actually. I said issue. I think that side of the argument would even say it's a problem, whether it's even recognized as a problem, identified as a problem. It's still a problem. That's what that side of the argument says. The other side says basically it's not a problem, because this is where I think that side of the argument kind of rested on, I don't know, a kind of populist view. They said, it's not a problem. It's not a problem because the rule sets sell, they're enjoyed, and there aren't any serious objections to over the claims of historical accuracy. So interesting. I mean, you know, it's an interesting discussion. Not really resolved, but it's an ongoing discussion. So that's been, I mean, I really just got to simulation and a little bit obliquely reference to historical research accuracy and inputs. Oh, and finally, my example of marksmanship here is that I had this funny, played this funny scene in my mind where, as a junior soldier in the cold, let's say, bundled up out there on the range, you know, walk to my firing position, jump down in the foxhole, and get ready to start the test. And then there's a, you know, a barrel-chested, you know, grognard, I'm using the word grognard NCO standing over me, and he's growling at me, you know, all right, soldier, you better do the best you can. And then right when the test starts, I lay my rifle down on the ground in front of me, and I pull out my dice, and I start rolling the dice and writing down the results. And of course the NCO is, you know, screaming at the top of his lungs, what in the, you know, bleep are you doing? And then I start trying to explain to the NCO that I could just as easily, that I've got all this data that I've come up with, I've got all these, processes, and I don't need to go through the marksmanship test. I just have to roll the dice, and I can come up with an equally valid score. I don't think that would have gone over very well.